I've worked in psychiatric care long enough to know that confusion can come from anywhere. Patients, paperwork, even staff exhaustion. But there's one night I'll never forget, because no matter how I turn it over in my head, it still doesn't add up. It was a Tuesday early afternoon on the locked ward. Quiet hours. The kind of lull where the patients either nap, watch TV, or sit together in the rec room under the soft buzz of the fluorescent lights. I had just finished medication rounds and was updating notes when one of the newer nurses came rushing up to me, pale as a sheet. She said, "I just saw patient 14 in the rec room." I blinked. "That's impossible. He was transferred this morning, left in an ambulance at 9 a.m., headed to a facility 200 miles away." She shook her head. "I know, but I swear I saw him. He was sitting in his usual chair, facing the TV, same sweatshirt, same calm stare. I even said hello, and he nodded back." Now, transfers are routine. The paperwork is thick, the checklist's precise, bags searched, belongings packed, discharge signed, ambulance documented. Patient 14 had been cleared and transported under 2 staff and a driver. I'd handed over his chart myself. He was gone. Still, I walked with her to the rec room, and there, sitting near the corner, was a man in a gray sweatshirt, shoulders hunched, same profile, same thinning hair. For a long moment my chest tightened, because it was him. It had to be. But when I stepped closer, my brain faltered. The man never turned his face. He just sat there, hands folded, eyes on the muted television screen. I knew every patient on that ward, and I knew patient 14 was no longer one of them. I did a quick count. Every name, every face, all were accounted for. No extra admission, no mix-up, no double booking. But this man, the one who looked just like him, wasn't supposed to exist here anymore. I whispered to the nurse, "Stay here, I'm checking the log." I hurried back to the nurse's station, pulled up the live census on the computer, and flipped through the files. Every patient matched, nobody unaccounted for, and patient 14 was officially listed as in transit at his new facility. I even called that hospital. The admitting nurse picked up and confirmed, yes, he had arrived, safe and sound, hours ago. When I returned to the rec room, the chair was empty. The man was gone. We searched the ward top to bottom, every patient room, every bathroom, even the staff closets. No one else had gone in or out. Security cameras at the locked doors showed nothing unusual. The hallway cameras showed no one entering or leaving the rec room in that span of minutes. But 2 of us had seen him. One swore she'd spoken to him. I had seen his shoulders, the cut of his hair, the way he sat exactly where patient 14 always sat. The strangest part, when I sat down in that chair, something small and cold pressed against me. It was a hospital wristband, the kind patients wear on admission. Printed across the plastic, half torn, was patient 14's name. I didn't say a word as I pocketed it, walked it back to the nurse's station, and locked it in my drawer. It wasn't supposed to be possible. He had been transported. He was 200 miles away, but I held the band in my hand that night, the very band that had been cut off him during discharge. I never reported it officially. What could I even write? Duplicate patient cited, wristband materialized. That would have gone nowhere. But every time I passed that rec room, I remember the gray sweatshirt, the quiet nod, the way the chair sat empty only minutes later. And I wonder, did I see a memory imprinted on the ward? A shadow of routine burned into those walls? Or did patient 14 somehow never leave at all? Even now, years later, whenever I transfer a patient, I double-check everything. Not because I don't trust the process, but because part of me knows that in some corner of a quiet ward, under humming lights, someone might be sitting in a chair they shouldn't be sitting in, watching the television, waiting to be seen. Night shifts on a psych ward are tense enough without surprises. Every sound makes you alert. Every flicker on the monitors demands your attention. That's why fire alarms are the worst. They don't just pierce the silence, they set off a chain reaction of chaos. Patients panic, staff scramble, and everything feels one wrong move away from disaster. The night it happened, the ward was unusually calm. Most of the patients were settled. Meds given, the halls quiet. I was updating charts when the alarm shrieked to life, ear-splitting, mechanical. The kind that rattles your teeth and makes your pulse race. Training kicked in instantly. I grabbed the keys, shouted to the orderly on duty, and we began the sweep. Doors unlocked, lights on, patients gathered and counted. Every head accounted for. Every corridor cleared. The smell of smoke? Nothing. The heat of flames? Nothing. Just that relentless alarm echoing off the cinder block walls. Within minutes, security and maintenance joined us. They swept the entire building. Nothing. No fire. No smoke. No hazard of any kind. Finally, the system was reset. The alarm died, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt almost worse. We exchanged glances, tired, uneasy, but relieved it was over. False alarms happen. Systems glitch. We chalked it up to that. Until security pulled the camera footage. I was there when they played it back. The monitor flickered, showing the empty corridor by the alarm box, time-stamped just before the alarm tripped. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then, clear as day, a figure walked into frame. It was blurry, just a little out of focus, but human-shaped, tall, thin, moving with purpose. The figure walked straight to the alarm box, reached up and pulled the lever. The alarm lights began to flash. The siren blared. Staff started to rush into frame. But the figure, gone. One moment it was standing there, arms still extended. The next, the image glitched. The camera blinked to static for less than a second, and when the feed cleared, the figure had vanished. No turn, no exit, no trace, just gone. We watched the clip again and again. Security slowed it down, frame by frame. The figure didn't look like any of our staff. It wasn't a patient either. Not in uniform, not in gown. It didn't match the build of anyone on duty that night. Someone muttered, maybe a shadow, a glitch, but shadows don't pull alarms, and glitches don't leave behind moving shapes that trip real, physical switches. The strangest part? The alarm box itself showed no sign of being pulled. No fingerprints, no smudges, no trace of contact, yet the system had triggered exactly as if someone had yanked it. Afterward, nobody wanted to talk about it. It went down in the report as malfunction. But every night after that, walking past that stretch of hallway, I felt a chill, like the air held something left over, something watching. A few weeks later, during another overnight, one of the orderlies swore he heard footsteps near that same alarm box, heavy, deliberate steps on linoleum. But when he turned the corner, the hall was empty. I don't claim to know what we saw. I only know what the footage showed, a figure appearing out of nowhere, pulling a fire alarm, then vanishing into static. And to this day, whenever the alarm sounds, I don't just brace for chaos. I wonder if it's the system, or if it's that figure again, waiting for another chance to remind us it's still there. Nights on a locked psych ward have their own rhythm. During the day, the place feels busy, almost chaotic, patients moving between groups, meds being passed, doctors rounding, families visiting. But at night, everything changes. The halls stretch longer, the air grows heavier. You notice every little sound, the squeak of my shoes on the waxed floor, the low hum of the vending machine, the clank of doors when they shut. That's why the first time I heard the music, it stood out immediately. It was around 2 in the morning. I had just finished checking room 9, a patient who liked to dismantle anything with screws if you weren't careful, and I was walking the east wing. That's when I passed the storage closet. A heavy metal door, always locked. Behind it were boxes of old personal effects, items left behind by patients who'd been discharged, transferred, or in some cases never picked up after they passed away. That closet had been locked for as long as I worked there. Nobody went in unless they had to. And yet that night as I passed, I heard it, faint, delicate music. At first I thought maybe a radio had been left on inside, or one of those little electronic toys that keep going if the switch gets stuck. But the sound wasn't modern. It was old, tinny, like the plinking melody of a child's wind-up music box. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear. The tune rose and fell with that mechanical rhythm, notes slightly uneven, just the way those toys play when the gears are winding down. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just listening, my skin prickling. Then it stopped, dead silent. I remember shaking my head, telling myself I was tired. Working nights does that to you. Your brain fills in shadows and sounds that aren't there. But the next night, at almost the same time, I heard it again. Same spot, same closet, that same faint tinkling, just loud enough to be clear, just soft enough to make you doubt yourself. After a week, I wasn't the only one. Frank, one of the orderlies, pulled me aside one shift. He asked, "You ever hear music down by the east closet?" I didn't answer at first, but when I saw the look on his face, I nodded. He exhaled, like he was relieved not to be the only one. "It's not just me then," he muttered. "Always sounds like a kid's toy." Word spread quietly among the night staff. Nobody wanted to make a big deal out of it, but almost everyone admitted they'd heard it at least once. Always after midnight, always when the halls were quiet, always from behind that locked door. It got to the point where I dreaded walking that hallway alone. I'd linger at the nurse's station, or find excuses to be on the west side when it was time for rounds. But avoiding it didn't matter. Eventually I'd have to pass that door, and more often than not, the music would be waiting. Finally, maintenance was called. Not because of the music, but because a new patient's belongings needed to be stored. I made sure to be there when they unlocked it. The door creaked open, and the smell hit us first. Dust, mothballs, and something metallic like rust. Stacks of cardboard boxes lined the walls, sagging with age. Some were labeled with names and dates from decades earlier. Inside were the strangest collections of items: tattered coats, old purses, photo albums, stuffed animals, shoes, little fragments of people's lives, sealed away and forgotten. And there it was, sitting on one of the shelves, a wind-up toy. A small tin clown holding symbols, paint chipped away, eyes faded. The key on the back was rusted solid. The maintenance guy gave it a twist, but it wouldn't move. He pried it open to check the mechanism, and the gears inside were corroded beyond repair. There was no way, absolutely no way that toy could produce a sound, let alone the clear music we'd been hearing. He laughed it off, tossed it into a plastic bag for disposal, and moved on. But I didn't laugh, because standing in that room, even with the toy broken open in his hand, I could swear I still heard a few faint notes drifting in the background. After that, the toy was gone, hauled off somewhere, maybe thrown out, maybe locked in another closet, I don't know. But here's the thing, removing it didn't stop the music. For weeks afterward, we still heard it. I'd be doing my rounds, past that same closet, and there it was, the same soft tinkling, the same lullaby that had no source. Sometimes it was faint, almost a whisper, sometimes clearer, like the toy had just been wound. But it was always there, when the ward was quietest, when your mind was sharpest from listening for trouble. Some staff started saying the closet was haunted, that the belongings in there carried pieces of the people who once owned them. Others chalked it up to stress and sleep deprivation. Me? I honestly don't know. All I know is that I heard it with my own ears. And so did others. More than once. To this day I can't listen to a music box without feeling uneasy. It doesn't matter where I am, in a store, at a relative's house, anywhere. That sound takes me right back to those nights in the East Wing, standing outside a locked door, listening to a broken toy sing songs it had no power to sing. And the thought that chills me most isn't that the toy played by itself. It's that even after it was gone, the music stayed. Like something or someone wasn't finished being heard. Working on a locked psychiatric ward, you learn quickly that documentation isn't just paperwork, it's survival. Every pill, every vital sign, every restraint has to be logged with precision. One missing detail can mean lawsuits, investigations, even losing your license. That's why the night I found the extra restraint in the log has never left me. It started during a shift I'll never forget. A patient, we'll call him patient 22, was in one of his volatile phases. He had a history of sudden aggression, and that night, it came out in full force. He started flipping chairs, threatening staff, trying to rip apart the fixtures in his room. We followed protocol, a show of force first, verbal de-escalation, giving him space. But when he began smashing his head against the wall, we had no choice. We called a code, gathered the team, and went in. Restraints are applied only as a last resort. Everything is by the book. A team leader assigns roles, 2 staff on the arms, 2 on the legs, 1 monitoring the airway. Once the patient is down, leather restraints are secured, 2 for the wrists, 2 for the ankles. That night was no different. We logged it, 4 restraints, applied at 11:14 p.m. I remember the adrenaline still pumping as I wrote it down. Initialing the log, the patient calmed after about an hour, breathing steady. No new outbursts. We released him under supervision and continued the shift. At first I thought nothing of it. Another crisis handled, another entry in the log. But hours later, when I went back through the paperwork, I froze. The restraint log didn't read 4, it read 5. My own initials, my own handwriting, written clean and clear. 5 restraints applied. That couldn't be right. There are only 4. Wrists, ankles, that's it. Unless we're counting a chest harness, which wasn't used. I pulled up the camera footage to double check. Every code on the ward is recorded, for everyone's protection. I watched us go in, the team taking him down, restraints going on. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exactly as I remembered. Nothing extra. And yet staring back at me from the official log was that impossible number, 5. I didn't say anything at the time. The others had gone home. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe I miswrote. But the unease stayed with me all night. The next morning, during shift change, I went to check on patient 22. He was groggy, lying in bed, still under close watch. When I pulled up the blanket to check circulation, my stomach dropped. There were 5 distinct bruises, not 4, 5. 2 on the wrists, 2 on the ankles, and 1 more, perfectly circular, just above his left knee. The same size, the same shape, the same pattern as a restraint cuff. I stood there staring, trying to make sense of it. I looked again, pressed gently. It was real, a bruise that hadn't been there before. I asked the morning nurse, casually, "Hey, you see this mark?" She glanced at it and shrugged. "Looks like another restraint bruise. Happens." But I knew. We only used 4. We only ever use 4, and the camera confirmed it. For days, I couldn't stop replaying the moment. The extra number in the log, my own handwriting. That fifth bruise. I kept thinking, did I see something wrong? Did I misremember? Or was there another set of hands in that room, holding him down, leaving a mark nobody else could see? The ward is full of stress, trauma, and echoes. Sometimes patients claim they're being touched when no one is near them. Sometimes they cry out at night for restraints that aren't there. We chalk it up to illness, hallucination, fractured memory. But this was different. This left a mark. Even now, when I sign the restraint log, I check it twice, 3 times, making sure the numbers match. Because part of me knows, deep down, that no matter how carefully we track and record, sometimes something else is in that room with us, and the patient isn't the only one it leaves its mark on. Hospitals have a way of holding on to their past. Whole wings get shut down, floors abandoned, but the building remembers. It creaks, it shifts, it breathes in the dark. Our psych facility had one of those places, the basement ward. It had been closed for more than 20 years. The patients had long since been transferred, the rooms stripped bare, the lights cut. The only way down was by stairwell or the staff-only elevator, and even that had been keyed so it wouldn't stop on the basement level. At least not officially. I first noticed it on a night shift, sometime around 3 in the morning. I'd finished my rounds and was heading back up from the laundry. I swiped my keycard, pressed 2 for the ward, and leaned against the wall, bone-tired. But instead of going straight up, the elevator slowed. The floor indicator ticked down. That wasn't possible. Basement was disabled. The elevator jolted. The doors slid open, and I found myself staring into blackness. A long hallway stretched out ahead, lit only by the spill of fluorescent light from the elevator car. The air that drifted in was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of mildew and dust. I remember whispering, "Nope," and jabbing the close door button until the panels slid shut. When the car carried me up to the ward, I convinced myself it was a glitch. Elevators malfunction all the time. Except it didn't just happen once. Over the next few weeks, every so often, always late at night, always when I was alone, the elevator would stop on the basement. No matter what floor I punched, the car would shudder, the light would ding, and the doors would part to reveal that same abandoned corridor. Sometimes the air felt colder, sometimes warmer, like the place had its own shifting breath. I wasn't the only one. An orderly named Diane admitted one night that she avoided the elevator altogether. She said every time she took it alone, it brought her to the basement first. "Like it knows," she whispered. She laughed when she said it, but her eyes told me she wasn't joking. One night, curiosity got the better of me. The elevator stopped again, doors sliding open with that familiar sigh. Instead of hammering the button, I stepped forward, just to the threshold. The beam of the elevator light barely reached past the first few feet of the hall, but I could make out door frames, patient rooms, empty now. The air was thick with dust, and somewhere in the darkness, I thought I heard something faint. A shuffle, a scrape, like someone dragging their foot just out of sight. My hand shot to the doorframe, ready to pull myself back. I waited, heart pounding, but no one emerged. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone down there. The next morning, I asked maintenance about it. They swore the basement floor was disabled on every panel. "No way you're stopping down there," one guy said. He even opened up the control box in front of me. Sure enough, the basement button was hardwired out. And yet that night, it happened again. The elevator stopped. The doors opened. And this time, as the gap widened, I swore I saw a figure standing at the end of the hall. Just a shape, backlit by nothing, tall and still. I didn't wait. I hit the button. Doors closed. Car shot up. I told myself it could have been shadows, a trick of my exhausted eyes. But a week later, one of the security guards radioed in, voice shaky. He said his elevator stopped at the basement. Doors opened, and he heard someone laughing in the dark. A child's laugh, echoing down the corridor. The guard refused to use the elevators after that. Walked the stairs for the rest of his time on the job. Officially, the basement is empty. Has been for decades. But I know what I saw, what I heard. And I know this, the elevator doesn't make mistakes. It's programmed, controlled, checked and rechecked. But something down there calls it anyway. To this day, whenever I ride that elevator and feel it hesitate, my stomach knots, because I know there's a chance those doors will open again, and I'll be looking straight into that dark corridor. And maybe next time, whatever waits in the basement won't just stay in the shadows. Working nights on a psychiatric ward, you get used to double-checking everything. We check doors, we check charts, and most of all, we check beds. Patients slip out of them at night, sometimes to wander, sometimes to harm themselves, sometimes just to pace the halls in silence. For us, the bed check is as routine as breathing. That's why the first time I saw the impression, it stopped me cold. It was a night like any other, past midnight, the ward quiet, most patients asleep, or at least settled. I was making rounds, clipboard in hand, shining my small penlight into each room. I came to room 11, a room I knew was empty. The patient had been discharged earlier that morning. The linens had been changed. Mattress smoothed out. It was clean, prepared for the next admission. But when I stepped inside, my light fell on the bed, and the center of the mattress was pressed down, deep, wide, exactly like the shape you see when someone has just gotten up. The sheets still carried the soft folds of weight that had only just lifted. I froze in the doorway. The air in the room felt heavier than the hall, almost warmer. I walked closer, running my hand across the sheet. It wasn't cold, it wasn't warm either, just neutral. But the impression stayed. I stood there long enough for my penlight to flicker slightly, and when I blinked again, the bed was smooth, empty, as if nothing had ever pressed into it. I didn't write it down. I didn't say anything. We all see strange things on night shift, and you learn quickly what's worth reporting and what's better left alone. But it didn't end there. A week later, another nurse, new to nights, came rushing up to the station. She said room 7's bed is occupied. We looked at her strangely, because room 7 had been unassigned for months. She swore she saw the mattress depressed, the pillow indented. She thought maybe we'd put someone in there without telling her. But when we went down together, the bed was flat, sheets untouched, no one inside. It started happening more often after that. Not every night, but enough that it became a quiet rumor among staff. You'd finish a round, glance into an empty room, and for a split second the mattress would dip, as though someone invisible had just climbed out. One night I decided to test it. Room 14 was unoccupied, bed freshly made. I went in, smoothed the sheets myself, pressing out every wrinkle until the surface was taut. I left, closed the door, and made a mental note of the time. When I came back an hour later, the bed had a clear hollow, the shape of shoulders and hips resting in it. The rest of the sheet was undisturbed, like someone had lain perfectly still. I walked slowly around the bed, scanning the floor for signs of anyone sneaking in. Shoe prints, stray lint, hair. Just that single, undeniable impression. Sometimes we tried to laugh it off, telling each other the mattresses were old, the springs warped, maybe they sagged unevenly. But we all knew better. Mattresses don't smooth themselves out right before your eyes. They don't dip only in the shape of a body. The strangest part was what the patients said. A few times during morning checks, one or two mentioned someone sitting on my bed during the night. They'd wake up and feel the weight near their legs or chest, pressing down, though no one was there. More than one described it the same way, like a visitor who never spoke, never moved, just sat silently until the feeling passed. I'll never forget one particular patient, a quiet woman in her 60s. She told me in the softest voice, "There's a man who lies down next to me at night. Doesn't say anything, just breathes." Her bed was on the west wing. I'd seen impressions there more than once. You start to question yourself, working in a place like that. Is it fatigue, shadows, overactive imagination? But impressions leave evidence. They're physical. And when you walk into a freshly cleaned room and see the undeniable weight of someone who isn't there, it's not something you can reason away. I've left that ward now, but even in my own home, sometimes when I walk into the bedroom, I catch myself staring at the mattress, wondering if it's flat, wondering if it's empty. Because the hardest part of those years wasn't seeing the impressions, it was knowing, deep down, that something had made them, and whatever it was, it never signed the census sheet. Psych wards are strange places, not because of what you see, that part you can prepare for. The shouting, the silence, the endless pacing, the eyes that never quite meet yours. You can get used to all of that. What you can't prepare for are the moments when something happens that cuts through the routine, through all the clinical explanations, and leaves you with questions you'll never be able to answer. That's what happened the night we admitted a new staffer. Her name was Marissa. Young, bright, fresh out of orientation. You could tell she was nervous but eager, the way most of us were on our first days. She came onto the evening shift, badge clipped neatly, scrubs still stiff from the wash, smile a little too wide to be real. I was showing her around, nurse's station, med room, charting computers, standard walkthrough before we started rounds. As we headed down the hall, one of the long-term patients, a man who rarely spoke, suddenly turned his head. He'd been sitting cross-legged on the floor, rocking gently, eyes usually fixed on nothing. But as soon as Marissa walked past, he locked onto her. His voice was low, raspy but clear. "I remember when you drowned." The words dropped into the hallway like a stone into still water. Marissa froze. She turned toward him slowly, her face pale, eyes wide. For a moment I thought she'd misheard. I was about to reassure her, brush it off as one of the endless, random comments patients make. But then she whispered, "How did he know that?" Later, in the safety of the nurse's station, she told me the truth. When she was 9 years old, she nearly drowned. Fell into a lake during a family outing. She was under for almost 3 minutes before her uncle pulled her out. She survived, but it left scars, nightmares, fear of deep water, a memory she carried quietly into adulthood. She had never told anyone at work, not in her interview, not in orientation, not even in casual conversations with us. And yet this man, who had never met her before, who had no access to her records, who barely spoke most days, looked at her with steady eyes and said those exact words. "I remember when you drowned." I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he guessed. Maybe he threw out random sentences until one happened to stick. Patients sometimes do that. Strings of words, fragments that sound meaningful only because we're searching for meaning. But the look on Marissa's face told me this wasn't just coincidence. The patient didn't say another word that night. He went back to rocking, staring into the space ahead of him, as though nothing had happened. But the effect on Marissa lingered. She finished the shift quietly, hands shaking when she charted, eyes darting every time she passed his door. On her break, she confided in me again. "It wasn't just what he said," she whispered. "It was how he said it, like he was there." She didn't mean there on the ward. She meant there, on the lake shore, years ago. After that night, she lasted maybe 3 more weeks before transferring to another unit. Too many reminders, too much unease. She told me she wanted to work somewhere less heavy. I didn't press her, but I knew why she left. That moment with the patient had planted itself deep, like a splinter she couldn't dig out. I stayed, of course. This line of work changes you. You learn to live with the unexplainable. But I'll admit, sometimes when I'm walking the halls at night, I think about Marissa. I think about the way her face went slack with shock, how her voice broke when she whispered, "How did he know?" And I think about the patient himself. He's still here, years later, still rocking in the hallway, still silent most nights. Every so often, though, he looks up at passing staff and mutters something, a phrase, a detail. Sometimes it's nonsense, but sometimes it's something that makes a person stop cold, like he's reaching into the past and pulling out a memory that doesn't belong to him. I don't know if he truly knew what happened to Marissa that day at the lake. I don't know if he saw it, dreamed it, or if it was just some impossible coincidence. But I do know this. The look in her eyes told me she believed him. And on this ward, sometimes belief is scarier than the truth. Working psych, you get used to repetition. Patients repeat words, phrases, even entire conversations, sometimes dozens of times a day. Usually it's random, a single line stuck in their minds like a broken record. But every so often, something repeats across patients, different ages, different diagnoses, even different years, and that's when you start paying attention. For us, it was a name. The first time I heard it, I didn't think much of it. I was doing my night rounds when one of our long-term patients, a man who rarely spoke, suddenly whispered as I passed, "Dr. Halloran." I thought he was recalling some old physician, maybe from a past facility. Patients often carry fragments of their histories like that. I noted it on his chart and moved on. A week later, another patient said it. A woman in her 40s, admitted only a few months. She was pacing the hall, restless, when she looked at me and muttered, "Dr. Halloran won't like this." Then she ducked into her room and wouldn't come out for the rest of the shift. That got my attention. 2 patients, unrelated, using the same name. Soon it was more. A teenager admitted after a breakdown mumbled it in his sleep. An elderly woman, disoriented, asked staff when Dr. Halloran was making rounds. And always, the tone was the same, uneasy, fearful, like they were speaking of someone with authority. The name began to ripple through the staff as well. Orderlies joked about it at first. "Better chart that or Dr. Halloran will get you." But beneath the jokes, I saw unease. It was too consistent, too specific. Finally, one of the senior nurses decided to dig. She went down into the archives, the dusty basement where the old paper records are kept, back before everything went digital. She spent her lunch hour flipping through yellowed files and brittle ledger books. When she came back, her face was pale. She laid a photocopy on the desk. There it was, in black and white, Dr. James Halloran, Chief of Psychiatry, 1942. He had run the very same ward we worked in, 70 years earlier. I remember sitting there staring at that name, feeling the hairs rise on my arms, because none of our current patients would have known that. Their ages, their histories, their backgrounds, it was impossible, and yet they were muttering it, repeating it, whispering it in the dark. We tried to rationalize. Maybe the name lingered in old files, spoken aloud by staff at some point, overheard by patients. Maybe it had worked its way into the culture of the place, passed down like an urban legend. But when we checked, not a single one of us had mentioned him before the patients started. None of us even knew the name until the research was done. The strangest part was how the mutterings clustered. They came most often at night, in the west wing where the oldest rooms still stood, peeling paint, heavy doors, original fixtures. Patients housed there were the ones most likely to say it. Sometimes they'd just whisper, "Dr. Halloran." Other times they'd speak as if he were still doing rounds. "He's coming. Don't let him see." One night a patient woke screaming. When I reached her bedside, she was shaking, clutching her blanket. Between sobs she whispered, "Dr. Halloran was standing over me." She had never heard his name before. She had no reason to know it. but she said it with certainty. I've worked a long time in this place, and I've seen enough to know when something doesn't add up. Names don't just echo through decades without cause. People who never met can't describe the same figure, the same presence, without a thread tying it all together. We never found out much more, just that Dr. Halloran retired in the early 50s, passed away quietly a few years later. No scandal in the papers, no record of abuse or controversy. But something of him, his authority, his presence, seems to have lingered here. Long enough for patients to sense it. Long enough for the walls themselves to remember. Now, whenever a new patient mutters a name under their breath, I listen carefully, and if it's Halloran, I don't brush it off anymore. Because I've come to believe the patients aren't just recalling memory, they're picking up on something that never left. I'll tell this straight. No flourish, just what I remember. Nights on the ward teach you to listen for everything. Footsteps, a muttered name, the scrape of a chair. You learn to expect noise. So when an entire wing fell silent, all at once it felt like the building was holding its breath. It started small, the first time. Around 2:30 in the morning, I was doing my routine, med cart, vitals, quick check-ins. The West Wing had 20 beds, most of them occupied by long-term patients who'd been there for months, even years. They made noise on their own schedule, a television left low, someone tapping a spoon, a lone cough. That night, as I passed the nurses' station, the fluorescent lights hummed and the monitors beeped in their steady rhythm. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. Not just quiet, not hushed like when a shift changes. It was a cut. A dead drop from normal noise to nothing. Phones, pagers, the vending machine in the break room, all of it seemed to fade. The TV in room 4, which had been playing a soap a moment ago, went mute. A patient who'd been talking with his roommate mid-sentence froze mid-word. The quiet was so sudden my first thought was that the electricity had gone. I looked up at the ceiling lights. They were on. You learn fast to check your assumptions. I glanced at the vital monitors, all green. The wing's main door was locked. No fire alarms, nothing tripped. I walked down the hall and did a head count, same as always. 20 patients, 20 bodies. Every bed occupied where it had been, but the voices that usually filled the hall were gone. It wasn't peaceful. Peace has a softness to it. This silence felt like it had a presence, heavy and watching. It pressed in through the linoleum, through the fluorescent light, through the small motor of the ceiling fan. For the first minute, I stood there like an idiot, listening for a sound that wouldn't come. I remember my own breath felt too loud. We radioed for the on-call psychiatrist, and the charge nurse came over. They did what you're trained to do. Approach calmly, speak softly, call each patient by name. We checked for distress, tried to engage for eye contact. A few of the long-term patients looked at us, blank, but no one spoke. No one reacted to their name. It was as if the ability to make noise had been taken from them. After 10 minutes of that, the hall slowly filled back in. A cough here, a soft murmur there. The TV in room 4 flickered, and the sound came back as if someone had turned it back up. The patients resumed whatever they had been doing, as if someone had paused a recording on them and hit play again. We wrote the incident up as temporary mutism, no physiological cause found, and filed it. That night, exhausted, I tried to sleep but couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Then it happened again. This time it was the East Wing. A month later, same hour, 22 beds, same sudden cut. The staff who were on duty that night, different people, different shifts, all described the same thing, a total immediate silence like someone had flipped a switch. The patient who had cartilage removed before the weekend showed up with a bruise on his forearm afterward and swore someone had been standing at the foot of his bed. We searched the cameras. Footage showed the hall going still, mouths closed, eyes vacant for roughly 6 minutes. Nothing else, no shadow, no figure, nothing to explain why voices stopped. Rumors spread, as they do. Some colleagues called it mass psychogenic silence and threw around words like contagion and suggestion. Others said it was just a coincidence. Patients with different diagnoses experiencing the same symptom because they were on similar meds. We ran checks, pharmacy records, recent changes in shifts, temperature logs. There was no common medication change, no new batch of food, no structural problem. The maintenance logs were clean. We even had the hospital's electrical engineering team do a sweep, nothing unusual. But the subjective experience stayed with us. Staff said it felt wrong. That's not a clinical observation, I know, but it's accurate. When 20 people stop at once, it isn't just the lack of sound, it's the intention implied in that lack. A lot of my colleagues told me they felt exposed, like someone was listening in from the other side of the silence. You begin to notice small things you didn't before, the way the fluorescent lights cast dual shadows, the smell of disinfectant amplified without noise, the way the tiles seemed to absorb rather than reflect sound. Once, after the silence lifted, an elderly patient who'd barely spoken in months said, plain as day, they're listening tonight. He didn't elaborate, Another patient, lucid enough to be dangerous with what he did remember, simply clutched his pillow and told me he dreamt someone had counted in his room. Slow, methodical numbers down from 20, and when the count finished, all the talking stopped. We tried to treat it like any other clinical event. Document, observe, monitor for changes. We increased checks for agitation and self-harm. We kept the med team on standby. We notified family members as necessary. But paper and protocol don't reach the part of your gut that tightens when an entire ward goes mute. One senior nurse began to keep a quiet log outside of the official charting. She wrote down the days, times, which wing, and what each patient was doing before the silence. Over months, a pattern failed to emerge except for one detail. It always happened between 2 and 4 in the morning, lowest human traffic, the hour when the night does most of its work. Over time, more staff admitted they had dreams or flashbacks afterwards. Voices in a language they couldn't quite understand, the sensation of lips pressed against the back of their neck. That could be stress, it could be sleep deprivation. Or it could be something else, something that takes advantage of the thin hours. A psychologist came in and spoke with staff in a debrief. He suggested mass anxiety, a group conversion symptom under the pressure of chronic institutional stress. He had data, charts, careful language. His explanation made sense in meeting rooms. It didn't sit so well in the hallway at 3 a.m., when the mattress hollows look like someone's been sitting on them and no one answers their name. We never found a smoking gun. No HVAC contaminant. No gas leak. No coordinated prank. Nothing in the footage but unmoving mouths and vacant eyes. But the events changed us. Staff who'd been on nights for decades retired earlier than planned. Some requested daytime schedules only. New hires were warned about the quiet. We developed unspoken rituals, a round where at least one staff member would sing an old nursery rhyme aloud during those hours, or leave the radio on in the break room. Anything to add noise back into a space that occasionally decided to turn it off. If you ask me now what the silence was, I'll tell you the truth. I don't know. I can list the clinical possibilities and the tests we ran, the logs we checked, the footage we rewound frame by frame. I can tell you what policy says we should do in an event like that. But I can also tell you what it felt like, a listening that was not ours, a pause that carried intent. It changed how I walked the halls at night. It made me appreciate small sounds, a kettle boiling, a drawer sliding, a patient humming a tune under his breath. They're anchors. So if you ever find yourself on a night shift and the wing goes suddenly, impossibly quiet, don't confuse it with peace. It's not the same thing. Stand where you can see everyone. Call names. Make a sound small enough to be human and loud enough to break whatever is listening. Because for reasons we couldn't map, that's the thing that brought our patients back. The human sound that refused to be swallowed.
I'm keeping this plain, just the facts as I remember them, because the details are what make it stick. We do checks on that ward every 15 minutes. Doors, windows, bed rails, bathrooms, everything. It's the kind of habit you don't think about until something breaks the routine. That night started ordinary. Late spring, the kind of warm that makes people restless. I'd finished the med pass, done the quiet rounds, and was halfway through my paperwork when the charge nurse called me over. There'd been a request. Someone couldn't get the bathroom door open in the east wing. She said it like it was small, the same way you'd report a stuck drawer. I grabbed my flashlight and the master keyring and walked over. That bathroom services 4 patient rooms. It's small, sink, toilet, shower stall with the institutional mirror above the sink. The door has a simple privacy latch on the inside and an emergency release key on the outside. It's dull hardware, nothing fancy. People lock themselves in sometimes to get a minute of quiet, sometimes because they need to be alone. It happens. When I reached room 3, a patient was at the doorway pacing, voice tight. He said he'd heard banging from inside 20 minutes earlier and knocked, but the door wouldn't open. We have a protocol. Call the nurse, call the charge, listen at the door, talk to the person inside. If there's a medical emergency or self-harm risk, we go in. I knocked. It's staff, I said. Nothing. I rapped a little harder. Open the door for me, please. No response. I pressed my ear to the metal and listened. I heard only the distant hum of the ventilation. No water running. No voice. My first practical thought was blockage. Maybe the latch seized. I tried the emergency release. Nothing. The key turned, but the latch didn't click. Now the patient was getting louder, upset. He kept saying he'd heard a scraping sound, and then a thud, and that someone had started whispering. He was agitated, so I moved fast. I radioed for maintenance and for another staff member to stand by. Privacy is a thing, but safety is first. If someone is in there and needs help, we have to act. Maintenance arrived in about 12 minutes, faster than usual, which told me they knew the drill. They tried the key again, then another, then a little lubricant, still nothing. The door was stubborn. We listened at the jamb and the seams, and then we tried to look through the transom above the door. The transom was too narrow. All we could see was the top of a shower curtain. No movement. At that point, the team made the call to force entry. We don't like doing it. Besides the damage, bathrooms are legally private spaces.
breaking in is something we document and justify thoroughly. But by then the patient outside was shaking and crying, and the time had stretched long enough that I was worried what if someone had a seizure in there, or an accidental injury. We couldn't risk waiting. Maintenance used a hand tool to disengage the latch the way we always do in emergencies, a small pry to the jamb, careful so the frame isn't ruined. The door stuck for another long breath, then came free with a metallic groan. The sudden whoosh as it opened filled the hallway. There was no one inside. That alone would have been puzzling. The shower was dry. The towel rack hung empty. No clothing on the floor. No obvious sign of injury. But what stopped me was the mirror. It was covered. Not fogged by steam. Not a smear you could wipe away. Handprints, dozens of them. Dense prints, layered across the glass, overlapping like someone had pressed palms into it repeatedly. They ran from the center to the corners. Some smudged, some crisp, some with fingertip streaks as if someone had dragged their fingers in a frantic pattern. The prints were water-streaked in places but mostly brownish, dried residue that looked like dirt, mixed with something else I couldn't name in the fluorescent light. I stepped closer. The outline of each palm was clear enough to see fingernails. One print near the edge showed the imprinted ridges of a ring. The sink counter had droplets, like someone had splashed water, but there was no puddle. The shower curtain had been pushed aside, but it wasn't torn. The soap dish had been knocked to one side. It looked like a struggle of sorts had happened right there, in front of the mirror, but with no one now to answer for it. I called for gloves and a camera. Forensics aren't called for every locked door incident, but when something looks like potential assault or self-harm, we escalate. Security logged it. The patient who'd complained earlier swore someone had been in there, and that they'd heard whispering through the door. Soft phrases, he thought, like someone practicing words. He said it felt like the words were meant for him. We checked the hallway camera footage up to the point when the door was forced. There is no camera inside bathrooms for obvious privacy reasons, so we only had external angles. The footage showed nothing entering or leaving the bathroom in the 40 minutes prior. No staff, no other patients. The hallway outside the nearest rooms had been empty. I watched the grainy black and white feed twice, 3 times. Nothing. The only movement was my own figure pacing with a flashlight and maintenance crouched with tools. We photographed everything in the bathroom, each handprint, the smears on the sink, the soap displaced. Maintenance bagged the mirror as evidence and removed it to chain of custody storage. They noted the prints looked old and new at once. Some smudges were still tacky. They tried to swab a print for prints, but the result was inconclusive. The lab later said the samples were degraded, contaminated by cleaning agents from earlier in the week, and whatever residue had been on the person who left the marks. The patient's account was inconsistent. One moment he said the voice had been a woman's, then later that it was a child's. Others on the wing, when asked, remembered hearing a faint tapping through the door, 3 quick taps, then silence. Nobody could agree on the timing. This is where the clinical world pushes back. Memory is malleable, time stretches, fear adds its own texture. Still, the physical evidence remained. The mirror, as if someone had reached out and made themselves visible only to a glass that could not hold them. We filed the incident in the report and closed the circuit of care. Increased checks in that wing for the next 72 hours, a referral to psychiatry for the affected patient, and a maintenance order to replace the mirror and reseal the jamb. The psychologist suggested the marks could be an elaborate hallucination that someone had acted out in another room and then wiped away, an internal projection made external. It made sense on paper, but I can't shake the image of that bathroom. The way the light caught the smudges. The sense that someone had been right up against the mirror, palms pressed flat, trying to see themselves, or to be seen. Even after we replaced the mirror and sealed the door, staff who passed by that bathroom later said they felt watched, as if fingers still hung in the air where the glass had been. We joked nervously, of course there's power in a laugh between night shift people trying to keep fear small, but jokes don't remove the residue. They don't explain how a locked door stayed locked while something inside left a set of handprints on glass and then vanished. They don't explain why the patient outside recalled whispered words that none of us could hear. I left the ward months later, but I still think about that night. Sometimes I find myself pausing in front of mirrors in my own house, half expecting to see smudges appear from nowhere. I wipe my hands on my jeans and tell myself it's fatigue, imagination, the sort of thing our minds make when we spend nights listening for danger. And yet when I brush my fingers across the glass, there's that small private memory, palms pressed, searching, and the impossible ache of an empty room that had just somehow held someone who left their fingerprints on the world and then stepped out of it. Working nights on a psych ward, you learn to balance 2 truths at once. People see and hear things that aren't there, and sometimes what they describe is too consistent to ignore. For years, we brushed off reports of the man at the end of the bed. Patients on high-dose antipsychotics often say they see figures. It's common enough that it barely raises eyebrows. But what unsettled me and a lot of the staff was how often the figure was described the same way. Tall, thin, standing completely still at the foot of the bed, and always with no face. The first time I heard it was from a middle-aged man admitted during a manic break. One morning, as I checked vitals, he whispered, "Did you see him? The man at the end of the bed." His eyes were wide, but his voice was flat, resigned. He described a tall, faceless figure, dressed in something dark, who stood silently in the room through the night. I charted it as a visual hallucination, routine. But then weeks later, a young woman, different diagnosis, different wing, pulled me aside after evening meds. She said, "Don't leave me alone tonight. The man comes when the lights go out. He just stands there, at the end of the bed." It happened again and again. An older patient in the West Wing, who rarely spoke, looked past me and muttered, "He's right behind you." Another patient woke screaming, clawing at the sheets, saying the man had leaned forward like he was about to climb onto the mattress. The unnerving part? None of these patients were ever housed together. They weren't in group therapy at the same times. Some had no ability to communicate with others at all. Yet the details stayed the same. We started to keep track quietly. One of the orderlies, Diane, began a notebook. Each time a patient reported the figure, she wrote down the date, the wing, and the description. After a few months, she showed me the list, 7 separate patients, across 3 different wards, none of them connected, all describing the same tall, faceless man at the foot of their bed. One night, I made my rounds and stopped in room 12. The patient was awake, staring straight at the foot of the bed. I asked what was wrong. Without moving her eyes, she whispered, "He's here. Don't you see him?" I turned, half expecting to see nothing but the door, and of course that's what I saw. Empty space, faint glow of the hallway light. But the look on her face froze me. She wasn't frantic, she wasn't confused. She was utterly still, as though trying not to provoke something standing just beyond my sight. I sat with her until she finally closed her eyes. But when I left the room, I couldn't shake the sense that I had just missed seeing something. Security cameras didn't help. Hallway footage showed nothing unusual. Inside the rooms, there were no cameras for privacy reasons. But staff began to share their own unease. More than one said they'd felt watched while adjusting IV lines or changing linens at night, a sensation like someone standing too close behind them. One nurse, exhausted after a double shift, admitted she thought she saw a shadow at the foot of an empty bed. Just a tall shape where nothing should have been. She blinked, and it was gone. The psychologist on staff tried to explain it as a ward-wide suggestion effect, patients feeding into each other's hallucinations, staff subconsciously reinforcing the idea. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was all in our heads. But that didn't explain the ones who couldn't communicate, the severely disorganized patients who still pointed to the same corner of the room, eyes fixed on something none of us could see. The reports kept coming. Always the same, always at night, always the end of the bed. I've left that facility now, but I still think about the list Diane kept. Page after page of consistent accounts, identical across people who never spoke to each other. It leaves me with a question I can't shake. What if the patients weren't hallucinating? What if, medicated or not, they were the only ones seeing what the rest of us couldn't? And if that's true, then every time I close my eyes at night, I wonder, how close is the man at the end of my bed? Hey, a huge thank you to every viewer and subscriber who's been on this channel's strange, quiet ride. Your support means everything. If you're new, welcome. Please subscribe, hit the bell so you don't miss future stories, and give the video a like if it gave you chills. I want to hear from you. Share your own unsettling moments or any weird encounters in the comments and say what state you're watching from. I read every comment and I'll pin the best stories. Stay safe, keep your flashlight handy, and I'll see you in the next video.